I'm Isaiah J. Poole, and I'm here with Jeff Bryant, who is the director of the Education Opportunity Network and the editor of its weekly newsletter. And we've today released an education declaration to rebuild America. And tell me what gave rise to this declaration.
Isaiah, right now there's a fomenting rebellion across the country against top-down education mandates. You see teachers boycotting standardized testing, refusing to give the tests. You see parents opting their children out of the tests. You see people out in the streets in places like Chicago, Philadelphia, protesting against school cuts and against their schools being closed. But what we're not seeing is this widespread rebellion rise up into, from what I call the grassroots up to the grass tops. This education declaration is an attempt to do that, to bring the grievances of the grassroots up to national attention and to focus on a positive way forward.
And what is the main message of this declaration?
The main message is that for too long, over 30 years, education policies have been stressing standards while neglecting the opportunities that students need to reach those standards. Instead of focus, the focus has been purely on what people call the achievement gap.
Okay.
Whereas nobody seems to be paying any attention to the opportunity gap that causes the achievement gap.
Okay.
So what we're calling for is to address the opportunities students need. Instead of keeping the standards raising higher and higher, we need to support the students so they can reach that standard. And we haven't been doing that. We've been cutting the opportunities and cutting the supports.
And it's interesting that on the day that you're releasing this education declaration, there have been some interesting news stories. Here in Washington, D.C., where Michelle Reed used to be the school superintendent, and she went on a campaign to reconstitute some of the schools, engaged in mass firings of teachers, all in an effort supposedly to improve test scores in these schools. And we find in the Washington Post today that in many of those schools, the test scores did not improve. In fact, in some cases, they got worse. In Philadelphia, massive layoffs of teachers and support personnel. At the same time, a prison is money is being appropriated for a prison outside of Philadelphia. We've had the uprisings in Chicago. So how does all of that come together in this declaration?
Well, the kinds of inconvenient truths that you're bringing up are what is causing the widespread questioning of these policies. You know, you brought up the reconstituted schools in D.C. failing. In Chicago, some of the schools that were being closed or threatened with closure were the very schools that Arne Duncan created when he ran Chicago's. Yeah, the education secretary, when he ran Chicago schools. So there's an inconvenient truth that these things that are rolling across the nation, these mandates for closing schools, for using test scores to evaluate teachers, there's just this inconvenient truth that reform policies don't work. And that's what's feeding the grievances at the grassroots level. In our education declaration, we're calling for a new direction. Since this is obviously not working, people at the ground level in the streets can see it. We're calling upon people in the leadership level to recognize this and realize that we need a change of direction.
And people who go to the Education Opportunity Network.org can see the declaration and can actually attach their name to it.
Yes.
What do you hope will happen? What do you think will happen? You, by the way, used an interesting phrase in some of your writing, and that is the notion of an education spring. It brings to mind the protests in Egypt and in the Middle East for democracy. What does that education spring begin to look like here? What do you think will happen?
Just like the Arab Spring that you're referencing, there were different forms of rebellion in different countries, and the messages that were not always the same. And that's true in this education spring as well. We're seeing rebellions pop up in places that don't necessarily resemble what's going on in another part of the country. But underneath all of these rebellions are what I call common core grievances. Grievances against seeing schools being cut to the point where they can't offer quality education. Grievances in seeing blatant inequities in the schools, where schools that need the resources the most are, by design, getting them the least. We're seeing massive disempowerment. We now have school systems that are run without any democratic input. There are no longer school boards that are elected. How are parents supposed to engage with the school and get their voices heard? And finally, we're seeing widespread perception that reform measures are being driven by corruption. We're seeing money being siphoned off from public schools to organizations that are privately held. You mentioned Philadelphia. While they were firing all those school staff people, they're increasing charters, which are privately run. It's true they get public money, but they're privately operated. Now charter schools in Philadelphia represent a third of what's spent on schools in Philadelphia. So these widespread grievances are what unite this movement. And we're trying to bring those grievances together to not only acknowledge them and identify them to other people, but call for a positive way forward and reject what's been pushed down from us in the past.
Go to educationopportunitynetwork.org to read the Education Declaration and to add your support. Thank you.
Thanks, Isaiah.